Knights Errant of the Wilderness by Morden H. Long. Published 1919 and read by Cody, author of Auke-wingeke-tawso, or Defender of His Country. Knights Errant of the Wilderness, Chapter 2, Radisson and Groseilliers.
It is a far call from the bleak shores of Hudson's Bay to the fertile sunny valley of the St. Lawrence. Yet thither we must go if we are to follow the fortunes of that daring Frenchman who was to complete the work of Henry Hudson by founding the Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. It was the spring of 1652. The first golden rays of the rising sun were striking assailant the palisades and rooftops of the little fort of Three Rivers, Quebec. Already from the chimneys the smoke of breakfast preparations rose up into the clear morning air, and life was beginning once more to bestir itself for the day's work. Suddenly, with a harsh creak and jar, the great gate of the fort swung slowly back, and three youths stepped forth. With a blithe "Good morning" and a gay wave of the hand to the yawning sentry, they shouldered their muskets and trudged off towards the woods. It was clear that they were bound hunting, and their quarry was the wild fowl which found one of their favorite feeding grounds in the reedy marshes of that expanse of the St. Lawrence called Lake St. Peter. As they went along, the placid river on their left shone between the tree trunks like a great sheet of burnished silver. The first spring flowers were beneath their feet. The robins chirped cheerfully as they hopped about the grass, and the squirrels scampered along the branches, which already were beginning to bear a haze of tender green foliage. So peaceful was the scene that it was difficult to realize that all its quiet beauty only masked a deadly peril. For the terrible Iroquois were on the warpath. Farmers on the outskirts of the settlement, beginning their spring work, had been found slain and scalped by this ruthless foe. And now the whole population of the district was huddled together in the fort for protection, and farmers could work only under military guard or in large parties with their rifles ever at hand. About a mile from the fort, the boys met a herdsman. Quote, "Keep out of the foot of the hills," end quote, he said. Quote, "Things like a forest of heads were seen to rise up suddenly from the background there. Better return to the fort," end quote. Two of the hunters, alarmed by this warning, soon decided to turn back, but the third, with a toss of his head and a scornful laugh, resolved to go on. And so Pierre Radisson, as yet but a youth of 16, went forth alone to the hunt regardless of danger. It was that dauntless courage of the youth that was to make of the man one of the world's greatest explorers and pioneers. The boy's bravery had its reward in excellent luck. He wandered on about 9 miles from the fort, shooting geese and duck to his heart's content and hiding the game which he could not carry in hollow tree trunks. As the sun declined towards the west, he retraced his steps and already was within view of the fort when suddenly a terrible sight rooted him to the ground. There, half concealed by the long grass, lay the bodies, naked and scalped, of his two companions of the morning. Chilled with horror, Radisson stood for a moment stock still. Then his keen mind began to work quickly. The Iroquois must be there, near at hand. His best chance lay in gaining the rush-lined river bank, where he might hide in the reeds till night arrived, and then make a safe return to the fort. Immediately stooping low, he began to run towards the river, but as he did so, 100 plumed heads raised up from the grass and reeds and underbrush to see which way he went. From all sides, muskets began to crash out. As he ran, the fearless Radisson, without hesitation, fired back at his numerous foes. But it was in vain. He was surrounded. A score of hands gripped him. His rifle was snatched away, his arms were securely bound, and then, flaunting the scalps of his companions before him, they dragged him off through the woods to the spot on the shore where their canoes had been concealed. It was only Radisson's bravery that had spared him the immediate fate of his comrades. The Iroquois had seen them turn back while he had gone on with a laugh into the mouth of danger. When attacked by overwhelming odds, he had at once fired back. Insensible to pity, the Indians of all things loved bravery, and their admiration for the fearless French youth led them to make him a prisoner. They now dressed his hair like an Indian brave's, and daubed his face with their war paint. That night he lay down between two warriors under a common blanket. Quote, "I slept a sound sleep, for they wakened me upon the breaking of the day," end quote, he says of his own story. Then, embarking in their canoes, the Iroquois fired their muskets and shouted their shrill war cries in defiance of the French at the fort. They were Mohawk Indians, and their way home after their raid on the settlements lay up the Richelieu River to Lake Champlain and Lake George, and thence west to the land of the Iroquois south of Lake Ontario. There in their villages they would be welcomed by the old men, the squaws, and their children, and their homecoming would be celebrated by feasting and the torture of captives. On the journey, Radisson found ever greater favor with his captors. They taught him how to give the light, silent, skillful Indian stroke to the paddle, and how to hurl deftly the Indian spear. In the morning, he was the first afoot to begin preparations for the day's journey, and at night he was the first to unsling his pack and cut firewood for the encampment. When a young brave struck him, he thrashed him soundly with his fists. When an old man staggered beneath his burden, Pierre took it upon his own shoulders. And so, the Mohawks, thinking that he had become one of themselves, gave him a hunting knife and shaved his head in front, leaving on top the warlock of the Indian brave. Quote, "I viewing myself all in a pickle, smeared with red and black, covered with such a top, could not but fall in love with myself, if I had not had better instructions to shun the sin of pride," end quote, says Radisson. As they approached the Mohawk village, a host of men, women, and children swarmed forth with shouts of joy at the return of the warriors and cries of exultation over the poor captives. In their hands they brandished clubs and whips, and they quickly formed themselves into two long lines, between which the prisoners were compelled to run the gauntlet of their blows. The rule was for the victim to be led slowly, with arms bound, down to the lane of the tormentors, but when it came Radisson's turn, he was left free and told by his friends to run. Bounding quickly forward, the nimble lad ran so swiftly along the lines that the blows aimed at him as he passed fell on empty air, and amid shouts and laughter he reached the other end unhurt. There he was, caught in the arms of a captive Huron woman, who was the wife of a great Iroquois chief. They had lost their son, and her heart had gone out to the handsome French boy. They now asked the Council of Chiefs that Radisson might be adopted into the tribe as their son. So he was led into the council lodge and placed by a great fire around which the chiefs solemnly sat smoking the great council pipe and listened gravely to the passionate plea of the Indian woman for his life. At last, with many deep "ho-hos," which meant, "Yes, we are pleased," they gave their consent. Radisson's Indian father and mother were very kind to him. Their dead son's name was Orima, meaning a stone, and when they learned that Pierre meant the same thing in French, they became still more fond of him. His father gave a great banquet in his honor to 300 of the young braves of the Mohawks. To wit, decked out in more finery of feathers, colored blankets, and wampum belts than all the rest, Radisson was led, as they took part of such forest dainties as moose nose, beaver's tail, and bear's paws. The air resounded with shouts of "Chagan, Orima! Be merry, Pierre!" Pierre was now a Mohawk of the Mohawks. he quickly picked up the Indian language. He soon learned that the lower the woods from his companions, and became skillful as the Indians themselves in setting traps, tracking wild animals, shaping the bark of the birch into graceful canoes, and finding his way through the pathless forests. But though the life was wild and free and the Indians were kind, yet in his heart Pierre longed to return to his home at 3 Rivers, where his father and mother were mourning him as dead. And so in the autumn he planned his escape with a friendly Algonquin captive. They were out on a hunting expedition, and in the night Pierre and the Algonquin killed their 3 Iroquois companions, concealed their bodies, and fled by stealthy night's journey along the streams and through the forests till they were within a day's journey of 3 Rivers. But just as they thought they were safe, and were paddling boldly out across Lake St. Peter, they were spied by an Iroquois band on their way back from the raids on the settlements. Raising their terrible war cry, the Indians gave chase, while Radisson and the Algonquin raced back again for the shore. But the Iroquois, with their many paddlers, quickly overhauled them and fired a crashing volley which killed the Algonquin and disabled their canoe. Pierre himself was dragged dripping but unharmed from the water by the mocking Indians, to be reserved for a punishment of torture that was like to be far worse than death itself. Then followed once again the long journey back to the Mohawk village. As they approached them, 2 long slender saplings were felled and stripped of their branches and made into a yoke, which, fastened to the necks of the prisoners, held them helpless in a long single file. As they thus advanced, the men, women, and children rushed to belabor them with staves and leather bags filled with stones. From this plight, Pierre was rescued for a while by his Indian mother, who, rushing through the crowd of torturers with the anguished cry of "Orima, Orima," cut him free from the yoke and took him to her lodge. But soon there came a great angry throng which, with hideous cries and cruel mockery, dragged him forth again to the torture. The prisoners were placed on scaffoldings, and for 3 days the devilish work of torture was carried on. Had it not been for the protection of the friendly family, Radisson undoubtedly would have perished. And it was his fingers that were cut and gnawed, the soles of his feet were burned in the fire embers, and his thumb was thrust into a great pipe filled with live coals. On the 3rd day, more dead than alive, he was led before the great council of sachems to hear his fate. As before, his Indian father appeared in all his regalia as a great war chief and pled with passionate eloquence for Pierre's life, while his mother danced and sang of old-time deeds of Indian valor. Costly gifts were offered as compensation to the relatives of the 3 murdered Mohawks. Then they withdrew. Long and solemn was the deliberation, and at last Pierre's father entered again to speak and sing. As he finished, he cut the captive's bonds amid thunderous ho-hos that marked the approval of the deed. Pierre was now once again free. For more than a month he could not use his burned feet, but he was looked after tenderly by his Indian mother, and gradually his strength returned. All winter he lived in the Mohawk lodges, and in the spring of 1653 he went on the war path with the younger braves against the Eries, who lived to the west around Niagara. Radisson gained great praise for his skill in the chase and his bravery in battle. But though the white man may easily don the red man's paint and feathers, he cannot so easily assume the Indian nature, and in spite of appearances, Pierre was not a savage Indian brave, but a civilized white boy. So, with the autumn of 1653, there came upon him once more an uncontrollable longing to be with his own folk again. This time he planned more carefully. Taking only a hatchet, one morning, when the tingle of the fall frost was in the air, he sallied forth as though to spend a day in cutting firewood. But no sooner was he out of sight of the village than he broke into a steady, loping run, such as he could maintain for hours. All day, through the tangled forest, he kept resolutely on, following with keen eyes the faint trail, which he knew led to the Dutch settlement of Fort Orange, now Albany, on the Hudson. Nor did he pause when the light shadows fell upon the ground. Dawn found him haggard and faint, but still reeling on the dogged steps, and by nightfall he was safe in Fort Orange with the Dutch. But he had barely escaped capture. The Mohawks were hard on his heels. For 3 days he had to lie in concealment while his Indian friends roamed through the fort, calling out for their Orma to come back with them to the forest. But at last they gave up in despair and returned to their villages. Washing the war paint from his face and the grease from his hair, Radisson now assumed once again the dress and manners of the white men. A kind Jesuit priest, Father Poncet, supplied him with money. Descending the Hudson to New Amsterdam, now New York, Pierre took ship for Amsterdam in Holland, where he arrived in January 1654. Thence he went to La Rochelle in France, where in the spring he embarked on a fishing vessel bound for the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. At Isle Percé, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, he met some Algonquins on the way up the river to wage war on the Iroquois. He joined them, and in May 1654, after an absence of 2 years, he reached his home at Three Rivers. There he was welcomed by his father and mother as though he had returned from the dead, while his friends listened in amazement to the thrilling story of his 2 years of adventure amongst the savage Iroquois. But Radisson was one of those stirring spirits who could not long rust in idleness, and in Canada of those days there was always some perilous enterprise ready at hand for those brave enough to undertake them. A new situation had arisen with the Iroquois. These natives had embarked on a war with the Eries, and in order to be free to wage it and to secure greater supplies of powder and muskets, they had sought peace with France. So a truce was arranged, but the cunning Onondagas went forth. They professed a great love for the French and asked to have a settlement made in their country. Their real object was that the settlers and priests might be hostages in their hands. Then they could prevent the governor of New France from taking measures to punish them for their outrages by threatening to murder the French who had settled amongst them. The governor fell into the trap. In the very year that Pierre had escaped from the Iroquois, missionaries had gone among them. In 1656, Major Dupuis and 60 Frenchmen had found a colony called Onondaga, and in the following year a party of 2 Jesuits, 20 young Frenchmen, and 100 Christian Hurons prepared to set out from Montreal to reinforce the little settlement. They had 80 Iroquois as an escort, but the expedition was incomplete without an interpreter who could speak the Iroquois language fluently. Here was a chance for Pierre. The venture gave every promise of all the excitement he loved. He volunteered for the post. After long preparations, on July 26, 1657, the party set out. Early in the journey, it became clear that beneath the friendly behavior of the Iroquois lurked a savage treachery. The Huron warriors were suddenly set upon and murdered, and their women and children, in spite of the efforts of the Jesuits, were put up to torture. But the Frenchmen were not molested, probably because they thought it would be safer to attack them later. Radisson, whom they soon recognized as the Orma of the Mohawks, was treated kindly, and he, on his part, sent gifts to his Indian father and mother. After a series of stiff portages past the rapids above Montreal, their way lay amongst the most beautiful part of the St. Lawrence River. Great forests on either hand swept majestically down to the shores of the noble river, while its clear, sparkling waters were dotted with the fairyland of the Thousand Isles. Few white men had yet gazed upon this lovely scene, and the eyes of the Frenchmen shone with pride in this glorious heritage of New France. When they emerged on the blue expanse of Lake Ontario, they turned south and followed the shore to the mouth of the Oswego River. Ascending this stream, they finally reached Lake Onondaga, where they were warmly welcomed by the garrison of the fort, which they had come to aid. Fort Onondaga was in a small clearing on the crest of a low hill overlooking the lake. In the center was a substantial house with 2 high towers loopholed for musketry. For further protection, a stout palisade and a deep ditch ran about it, enclosing a space large enough to enable the French to keep their cattle within it. It was not long before alarming signs of the dangerous position of the little French force began to appear. The attitude of the Indians became menacing. They no longer pretended a desire to become Christian, but, ceasing to listen to the Jesuits' Bible stories, Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas strutted about in their war paint, while from the neighboring forest came the sounds of feasting and the singing of wild war songs. 400 Mohawks soon came to join the swarms of foes, and these impudently built their wigwams for the winter before the very gates of the fort itself. So vastly outnumbered were the French that they wondered greatly why the redskins delayed their attack. Then one day, through a Huron slave, came the news that the governor had seized 12 of the Iroquois and was holding them at Quebec as hostages for the safety of Fort Onondaga. Taking heart at this news, the Frenchmen settled down for the long siege that they knew now awaited them. Winter set in. The snow fell like a deep, soft blanket over the earth, and the song of the streams was hushed by the thickening ice crush. It was an anxious and dreary Christmas the Frenchmen spent that year, far from their friends in the midst of a treacherous foes. Their sentries were attacked at night, and by day they could venture abroad only at the risk of their lives. Fortunately, they had plenty of food, and the Indians, confident that there could be no escape before spring, bided their time. But in February, a terrible plot was revealed. A dying Mohawk confessed to one of the priests that the Indians were bent on massacring half the French and holding the rest till the Iroquois hostages were freed from Quebec. Radisson, who alone of the company could move as with a charmed life amongst the Mohawks, learned from his father that this news was only too true. Though they knew not how they could escape, yet the French began to make preparations for flight should the chance present itself. Their frail birch canoes could not possibly live in the ice-jammed rivers of early spring, and so they secretly built 2 large flat-bottomed boats. When these, by mischance, were seen by a Huron slave, a great danger threatened. He had heard the Jesuits tell the story of Noah's Ark, and now he spread abroad a wonderful rumor of how the white men were building great arks of refuge against a coming flood that would overwhelm the land. The suspicious Iroquois sent spies to investigate, but before they arrived, the French had built a false floor over their boats, and on it piled high their canoes. Thus the Iroquois were tricked, and went away thinking that the Huron had lied. And now the spring had arrived. The ice was breaking, and the heavy boats could force a way through. But how to escape from the fort and launch them and get safely away? That was the question. To this it was the resourceful Radisson who gave an answer. He had not lived amongst the Mohawks for nothing. He knew that the Indians were both superstitious and gluttonous, so he persuaded a young man in the fort to feign illness and invited the Indians to help in his cure by taking part in one of the feasts which they loved. The banquet would be spread generously by the French. Far and wide through the forest spread the news of the great feast of the white men, and the Indians flocked to the gates of the fort to partake in it. But for 2 days Radisson kept them waiting outside, smelling the savory odors of preparation and entertainment by the soldiers with music and songs and dancing. Then on the evening of the 2nd day, with a great blare of bugles, the gates were swung back, and out stepped the Frenchmen bearing the feast. Round the great circle of squatting Indians they went, with huge iron pots filled with venison, bear, steak, fowl, fish, and corn. The French had even slaughtered their own hogs, all save one, for the banquet. As soon as an Indian dish became empty, it was heaped up again from the pots, and when these began to run low, they were replenished from the abundance within the fort. Never had the Iroquois faced such a feast before, but whenever an Indian flagged or drew back, the pretended sick man cried out with a doleful voice. Some of the French, who had fiddles, played away with the might and main to keep up the excitement, while everywhere went Radisson urging the Indians on. At last, one by one, overcome by the gluttony, they fell into a sodden sleep. Now the moment had come for escape. Others of the garrison had been busy making preparations for flight. The 2 flat-bottomed boats and some stout dugout skiffs were quickly run down to the lake shore. The baggage was hurriedly boarded, and they were ready to start. But first Radisson completed his plot. Some old uniforms had been stuffed with straw, and these effigies, with hats and boots all complete, were stood up like sentries at different points in the fort. The poultry was also left behind, and one lone pig. Through a loophole beside the gate ran a rope attached to a bell, which the Indians pulled when they wished to summon the guard. To this rope the ingenious Radisson now tied the pig, so that when the Indians pulled, they would hear a movement within as though people were moving about in the fort. Then, locking and barring the gate, Radisson and his men climbed cautiously over the palisade and made for the boats. Silently, at the word of command, they pushed from the shore and melted in the blackness of the night. The Indians lay long in their gluttonous stupor, and when they awoke, their wits were numbed. A storm of sleet in the night had washed away the traces of the French departure. When the Indians pulled the rope, the bell did not ring, but movements were heard inside, and when no one came to the gates, they concluded that the black robes, as they called the police, were praying. They heard the fowls clucking and crowing, and when they peered through the palisade, they saw sentries on duty. But when at last, grown suspicious, they broke in and saw they were tricked, their amazement and rage knew no bounds. But pursuit was in vain. The French by now were on Lake Ontario, battling their way through the ice jams at the foot of the lake. Sometimes they could get through the ice only by chopping a passage with their hatchets, but slowly they forged ahead and at long last got into the river. There, the swollen current carried them quickly along and floated them safely over the rocks of the rapids, except for the loss of one boat. It was March 20th when they had stolen away from Fort Onondaga. On April 3rd, they reached Montreal, and on April 23rd, the little flotilla came safely to anchor beneath the frowning heights of Quebec. Onondaga was saved. Its settlers had escaped, as one of the Jesuits said, quote, like the children of Israel by night from the land of Egypt, end quote. And the chief credit of this exploit belonged to Pierre Radisson. He had won his spurs as a knight of the wilderness. He had become one of the heroes of New France. And now Radisson was to step from the role of a doughty Indian fighter to the still greater part of a far-ranging explorer. He had been home hardly a month before new plans of adventure began to possess him. Each summer there came from the distant mysterious west and north rich cargoes of beaver pelts. The Indians who brought them down the Ottawa River in their canoes told tales of vast regions that dwarfed New France to littleness, of mighty rivers which rivaled the St. Lawrence, and of distant unknown seas. Frenchmen had gone as far as Sault Ste. Marie and Green Bay on Lake Michigan, but beyond that all was unexplored. To Radisson, this region was like the enchanted castle to the prince in the fairy tale. He must be the first person to break the spell and tread the soil of that new land, for just as at the prince's kiss the beautiful sleeping princess would wake to life, so would the coming of the first great white man rouse the West from its sleep of centuries and give it to the world. In this project of exploration, Radisson found a kindred spirit in his brother-in-law, Medard Chouart de Groseilliers. Indeed, it is quite probable that it was Groseilliers who had first fired the imagination of the younger Radisson to penetrate into the Great West, for he was a veteran fur trader himself, who had been as far afield as Lake Nipissing and Green Bay, and he was full of the Indian stories about the country that lay beyond. So silently, one night in June 1658, having fully resolved to go on the great adventure, Radisson and Groseilliers launched their canoe at Three Rivers. Traveling only by darkness to avoid the prowling Iroquois, they reached Montreal in 3 days. There they joined a party of 150 Algonquins who were about to start back for their homes on the upper lakes. The way up the Ottawa River was beset by Iroquois war parties, and had it not been for the cool leadership of the two Frenchmen, it would have fared badly with the Algonquins. As it was, they managed to beat off their assailants, and then, reaching Georgian Bay by way of Lake Nipissing and the French River, they crossed the upper stretches of Lake Huron and Michigan and arrived at Green Bay. But even there, the terror of the Iroquois pursued them. Scouts reported that a band of Mohawks were on their trail, and panic seized the Algonquins. Radisson, however, headed a party of the more courageous, and tracking the intruders down with a cunning greater than their own, he pounced suddenly upon them and killed them to a man. Great was the gratitude of the Algonquins for this aid, and in their friendly wigwams the Frenchmen passed most of the winter at Green Bay. In the spring of 1659, they pushed onward to the west till they stood on the banks of, quote, a mighty river, great, rushing, profound, and comparable to the St. Lawrence, end quote. This could be only the Mississippi. Thus, 10 years before Marquette and Joliet, and 20 years before La Salle, Radisson and Groseilliers watched the torrid spring flood of the Father of Waters sweeping southward towards the Gulf of Mexico. As they raised their eyes from the swirling current to the distant shore, they were the first of all white men to gaze upon the broad and beautiful land of the great Northwest. All summer they ranged through this fairy land of nature. We cannot be sure just where they went, but apparently they first traveled southwest, for Radisson says, quote, we desired not to go to the north until we had made a discovery in the south, end quote. Turning north from this pleasant land, the two explorers visited among the Sioux, and then, veering to the east, in the fall they reached the Jesuit mission at Sault Ste. Marie, having passed through the territories of the Crees and the Saulteaux, whom they found at bitter war. Radisson's own story speaks of mountains lying far inland to the west, while the Jesuits tell of the travelers having been among the Indians who used coal. Judging from these things, Radisson and Groseilliers were not only discoverers of the West, but they must also have explored far into the very heart of it, perhaps as far as the edge of the Badlands of Montana. Had the two Frenchmen had any idea The winter of 1659 was one of the coldest ever known in Canada. But the colder the weather, the thicker the coat of the beaver, and so, in the spring of 1660, the adventurers were able to set out on a long journey to Montreal with a rich cargo of furs. They were attended by an escort of 500 Algonquin, Huron, and Sioux warriors. It was reported that 1,000 Iroquois were on the warpath against New France, so the utmost precautions were taken. All went well until they reached the head of the Long Sault, the most perilous part of the Ottawa River. Here they sighted 16 Iroquois canoes whose occupants had fled before them. Radisson at once guessed that they had a stronghold at the foot of the rapids. Taking half his men, he advanced quickly across the portage, only to find the Iroquois entrenched in a rough barricade near the river. But very unwisely, the Indians had left their canoes at the water's edge. The quick-witted Radisson at once directed some of his men to creep forward towards these, sheltering themselves behind great bundles of beaver pelts which they pushed before them along the ground. The Iroquois, seeing that they must either abandon the fort or be trapped in it by losing their boats, with a wild yell, rushed to the bank and made their escape down the river amid a pursuing splatter of bullets. the portage had been won. But within the fort, and the glade which surrounded it, a gruesome sight awaited them. The palisade pockmarked with bullets and breached in many places, the oozing muddy water of the well scraped in clay soil within, the scalps left dangling from the picket tops, and the charred remains scattered around the place of torture on the river bank, all spoke of a terrible tragedy recently enacted there. It was not until Radisson reached Montreal that he learned the full story of the famous stand of Daulac and his 16 comrades at the foot of the Long Sault. Had Radisson arrived but a few days earlier on the scene, the heroes who saved New France might have been saved themselves. At Three Rivers, the two explorers were greeted by their friends and relatives, for whom their 2 years' absence had been a long and anxious one. At Quebec, the capital, they were received like generals returning from a victory. Flags fluttered up to mastheads in salute, church bells rang out, and cannons thundered forth a welcome. The governor gave them gifts, and they were feted everywhere. For the rest of the year, Radisson lived quietly with his parents at Three Rivers. Most men would have been content with achievements such as his. He had done valorous deeds and had built up a lasting fame as an explorer. But Radisson was not yet 26 years of age. The hot blood of youth still ran in his veins. He thirsted still more for adventure. He was filled with the passion of penetrating yet further into great unknown regions of the continent. He had been to the west, he must now go to the north, and Groseilliers was equally ready and eager for the quest. From the Indians who came down the St. Maurice and the Saguenay, year after year, with their precious burden of furs for trade, the French continuously heard of certain, quote, great bays of the north, end quote. They guessed, of course, that this was no other than the bay discovered by Henry Hudson half a century before. But as yet, the English had taken no advantage of their discovery. Clearly the region about this northern sea was rich beyond all dreams in furs. The Frenchmen first to find the route overland to it would reap the reward of both fame and wealth. Now the Crees about the shores of Lake Superior, Radisson and Groseilliers had heard the same tale, and the Indians had claimed that every summer they went to hunt this Bay of the North. The two adventurers, therefore, determined to try and reach it overland by traveling with the Crees. But when they asked the governor, de Vongor, for permission to go on the voyage of discovery, they at once encountered difficulty. He would give the explorers a license to engage in the fur trade only on condition of their sharing half of their profits with him, and to trade without a license might mean fine, imprisonment, or even death. Radisson and Groseilliers, however, were men who would not hesitate to take a risk. They were resolved neither to submit to be thus plundered by the selfish governor, nor give up their expedition. So late one night in August, 1661, they embarked in their canoes at Three Rivers, and in defiance of the governor, set out again to try to win their fortunes in the wilderness. It was October before they reached Lake Superior and began coasting westward along the south shore. They were now in a region untraversed before by white men. Radisson heard from the Indians of the rich Superior copper mines and gazed upon the famous Pictured Rocks. At the western extremity of the lake, they struck inland, and somewhere near the boundary between Minnesota and Ontario now lies, they constructed the first fort and trading post in all the West. It was a rather crude structure, hurriedly built in 2 days with logs hewn from the surrounding forest. It was triangular in shape, with the base resting on the river, and it was roofed over with a thatch of interlaced branches. The situation of the two traders thus isolated in the wilderness was not without perils. They had stores of powder, shot, and goods for trade that might easily tempt the Indians to attack and murder them. To prevent a surprise, Radisson had recourse to that ingenuity which had so often saved him in difficult times. He strung cunningly concealed cords through the grass and branches about the fort, so that neither man nor beast could approach without blundering into them. To the strings he then attached little bells which could ring out at the slightest disturbance. More than once in the long winter, nights that followed, the little garrison stood to arms when the tinkling bells warned them of a presence prowling. As the news of these white men spread through the northern woods, more and more Indians came to visit them. So Radisson thought it wise to take a further precaution. Constructing little tubes of dry birch bark, he filled them with gunpowder and arranged them in a circle around the fort. Then one night, in the presence of the Indians, he suddenly seized a brand from the fire and applied it to the fuse. To the amazement and terror of the onlookers, the fire ran spurting and leaping along the ground till the whole fort was enclosed with a protecting ring of fire. That was enough. The white men were masters of magic arts. Thenceforth, they and their goods were safe. As the winter wore on, 400 Crees arrived, with an invitation to visit their encampment, which lay still farther northwest, towards the land of the Anishinabes, now Manitoba. The explorers accepted. They were welcomed by the Crees with feasts and dancing, and they soon won their way to the hearts of their Indian hosts by generous gifts and trinkets. And now, one of the most trying ordeals of forest life descended upon the travelers. Heavy rains were followed by an enduring frost, which formed a hard ice crust over the snow. This confined and killed the rabbits, grouse, and other small animals on which the larger game fed. The Indians are always improvident, and they had laid up no reserve store of food. Game had become scarce, and it now quite disappeared. Soon famine, the dread of winter in the north, began to stalk through the camp of Crees, and take its toll of life. The women and children suffered first, the selfish warriors snatching the food out of their hands to appease their own hunger. Then, as the scarcity increased, they had to dig down through the snow to get the roots from the frozen ground. They boiled the bark of trees and the bones from the waste heap to get a sort of soup. At last, the only food left was the buckskin that had been tanned for clothing. 500 Crees died of want in a few weeks, and it was not till early spring came that game reappeared, and the frail, emaciated survivors, who could scarcely drag themselves from their teepees, began to recover their strength. For 6 weeks in the spring, Groseilliers and Radisson hunted buffalo and deer in the land of the Sioux. Then they returned to accompany the Crees in their journey to the Great Bay of the North. For many days they traveled on rivers flowing in northward. Some claim that Radisson and Groseilliers got only as far as Lake Winnipeg, and that the upper lake to which they returned was the Lake of the Woods. Others contend that they actually reached Hudson Bay overland, and that the upper lake was Lake Superior. But this we know, that in the spring of 1663, Radisson and Groseilliers descended the Ottawa River at the head of 700 warriors, and with 360 canoes loaded with one of the richest cargoes of furs ever brought to Quebec. We know, too, that the explorers were convinced that they had reached Hudson's Bay, because it was their proclaimed design to return to this El Dorado of the fur trade, not overland this time, but by Hudson's Strait, in a large sea-going ship, which it would be possible to carry on a much greater trade than could be done with mere flotillas of canoes. But in this project they were destined to meet many checks. They had left the colony against the governor's orders. They had traded without a license. Groseilliers was thrown for a time into prison. They were fined $50,000, and $70,000 worth of their furs was seized as a government tax. Out of a cargo worth probably $300,000, the explorers were left themselves only a paltry $20,000. Groseilliers at once sailed for France to secure justice, but the influence of the governor with the court was too strong for him, and he failed. Then the two explorers secretly took passage to Anticosti, and thence to Isle Percé in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where, a French merchant had promised to send a vessel in which they could make a voyage to Hudson's Bay, but the ship failed to appear. Afraid to return to Canada lest they should be punished for their attempt to sail to the bay without a license, they turned south to Acadia. There, at Port Royal, they met Zachariah Gillam, a New England sea captain from Boston, whom they persuaded to attempt the voyage to Hudson's Bay. But the season was late, and off the coast of Labrador the captain turned back, despairing of being able to make the passage of the strait. In Boston, however, they were persuaded to try and induce the English king to sanction their project, and English merchants to back it with their money. So on August 1st, 1665, Radisson and Groseilliers sailed from Nantucket for London with Sir George Carteret, who had promised to befriend them with the king. Unfortunately, at that time, England was at war with Holland, and the Dutch warship Caper, after a desperate 2 hours' battle, captured the English vessel and her French passengers. The prisoners were landed in Spain, and it was not until early in 1666 that the two French adventurers set foot at last on English soil. It was the year of the Great Plague. Grass grew in the deserted streets of London, where once the roar of traffic had resounded and traders hawked their wares. There was now only heard the dread rumblings of the death carts and the mournful echoing cries of "Bring out your dead." From the afflicted city the king and his court had fled for safety in Oxford, and thither the Frenchmen followed them, where they were formally presented to His Majesty King Charles II. Great was the interest with which the king and his friends heard Radisson tell the story of his boyhood adventures among the Iroquois and the wanderings of Groseilliers and himself in the wonderland of the Northwest. But when the explorers told of the immense cargo of furs which they had brought down to Quebec on their last voyage, and unfolded their plans of an expedition by sea into Hudson's Bay, the interest of their listeners grew even more intense. Here, if the adventurers' tale was true, was the very seat and center of the fur trade. Here, lying unclaimed in the bleak, unpeopled north, was wealth that rivaled the gold and silver of Mexico and Peru. To the king and his friends, the prospect of acquiring these fabulous riches was enchanting. Radisson and Groseilliers at once found themselves in high favor. When the court moved back to Windsor, the king assigned them each £2 a week for maintenance, and a little later he ordered the Admiralty to place the ship Eaglet at their disposal for a voyage to Hudson's Bay. His Majesty also presented each of them with a gold chain and a medal, commending them graciously to the gentlemen adventurers of Hudson's Bay. Foremost among these, and one of their most enthusiastic friends, was that gallant old soldier and sailor, Prince Rupert, the king's cousin, whose love of adventure and desire of repairing his fortunes led him to lend his great influence to the undertaking. Other courtiers and some wealthy merchants of London, who had now become interested in the venture, added to the Eaglet a second ship, the Nonsuch, under Captain Gillam. During the winter of 1668, the little knot of merchant adventurers held many a close conference at the Goldsmiths' Hall or at Whitehall, and put their heads together over many a merry banquet at the 3 Tuns Tavern and the Sun Coffee House. At last, after the consumption of divers' pipes of canary and dinners with pullets, and after making merry, the expedition stood ready at the Gravesend docks to begin forth upon the enterprise which was to build for Britain in the New World an empire almost as large as Europe itself. Their instructions are quaint and interesting. Quote, "You are to sail with the first wind that presents itself, keeping company with each other, to your place of rendezvous. You are to sail to such place as Mr. Grosbery," the English name for Groseilliers, "and Mr. Radisson shall direct to trade with the Indians there. You are to have in your thought the discovery of the passage into the South Sea, and to attempt it, with the advice and direction of Mr. Gooseberry and Mr. Radisson. Lastly, we advise you and require you to use the said Mr. Gooseberry and Mr. Radisson with all manner of civility and courtesy, and to take care that your company do bear a particular respect unto them, they being the persons upon whose credit we have undertaken this expedition. We beseech Almighty God to prosper. Signed, Rupert Craven, J. Hayes, Albemarle, G. Cartet, and P. Pollockton. End quote. And now Groseilliers and Radisson had left behind kings and courts, cities and greedy plotting merchants. The fresh salt air of the sea was in their nostrils, and their faces were set towards that life of the wild, free woods which they loved. But disappointment was in store for one of them. Fierce storms arose. The little Nonsuch, with hatches battened down and heads held firmly to the wind, rode light as a cork over the great billows. Not so the heavier and more unwieldy Eaglet. Wave after wave caught her broadside on, and when the storm subsided, she was left with her deck sprung, her mast by the board, and her consort lost. There was nothing for it but to turn back, and in late September 1668, the Eaglet, with the chafing Radisson aboard, limped lamely into dock in the Thames. In the meanwhile, Groseilliers and Gillam, on the Nonsuch, made a quick and easy passage into the bay, reaching Digges Island on August 19th. For 7 weeks they coasted due south, and then came to anchor in a bay off a river mouth. They called the river Rupert River in honor of their princely patron, and the rude stockaded fort which they hurriedly built on the shore they named Fort Charles after the king. They were the first to penetrate to this remote corner of the great bay since Hudson's famous voyage of 1610-1611, and Fort Charles on the east shore of James Bay was the first permanent post to be erected on Canada's great North Sea. Such was the humble beginning of that trading company which was to fight out bloody feuds with French and Canadian rivals, whose imperial power was destined to expand until it embraced half the continent, and which today, after the passage of 250 years, is still active and prosperous. That rigorous, biting winter that had been so terrible to Hudson and other early voyagers did not daunt in the least Groseilliers, the forest ranger, and Gillam, the New Englander. The ship was beached on a sandbar and protected from ice jams by barriers of logs. They had an abundance of stores, firewood was at hand for the cutting, and through the long northern winter they lived snugly enough in their fort. From previous explorers, the Indians had hung suspiciously aloof, but Groseilliers on his snowshoes visited their distant encampments. He found that they were Crees, like those Indians with whom he and Radisson had traded on the shores of Lake Superior. Thus, knowing their ways and readily speaking their tongue, he soon won their friendship. A brisk trade in spurs sprung up, and when, in the spring of 1669, the ice broke up, and the little Nonsuch spread her sails for England, she carried that within her hold which was calculated to make glad the hearts of her merchant adventurer masters. Just how rich the cargo of the Nonsuch was we do not know, for there is no official record left, but we do know that it was such as to cause the owners to apply to the king with the utmost dispatch and secrecy for a royal charter, granting them the sole right to all trade and rule in the regions about Hudson's Bay. The adventure had been successful. The adventurers must now be formally organized, and their position must be made secure. On May 2nd, 1670, King Charles granted a charter incorporating, quote, the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay, end quote. At the head of the charter stand the names of the applicants, among them Prince Rupert, the Duke of Albemarle, the Earl of Craven, Lord Arlington, Lord Ashley, Sir Philip Cartet, Sir Robert Viner, Lord Mayor of London, and other noblemen and merchants. The shareholders of the mighty company, thus formed, were bound by a strict oath of faithfulness and secrecy. Thus, the merry monarch, with royal munificence, granted to his friends a vaster domain than any other one had dreamed of. Under the warrant of this royal charter, the dominion of the company was to spread north and west and south from the shores of Hudson's Bay, till it met the power of Russia in distant Alaska, and at last reached the Southern Sea in far-off California. Over this vaguely defined region which the company might penetrate, it was given wide powers of government. It could build forts, employ seamen, make laws, and punish for the breach of them. It could also expel and punish poachers on its trading rights. It could even make war upon any prince or people whatsoever that are not Christians for the benefit of said company and its trade. Over all their territory, the governor and company were to be true and absolute lords, with the obligation of paying in sign of allegiance to the King of England whenever he should visit their domains. At the head of this royal charter of trade and government, which for 200 years was to mold the destiny of half of North America, there stood the names of noble lords and London merchant princes. But though they have the pride of place, it is not rightfully theirs. It is true, the courtier lent his influence, and the merchant risked his gold. But these were necessary things. But the greatness of the great company has other deeper foundations than these. At the head of its charter should really stand the names of the men in whose minds the project had its birth, and by whose dauntless courage it was carried out in the wilds of the New World. Though history has long slighted and neglected them, none the less, the real founders of the Hudson's Bay Company were the two penniless but resolute French adventurers, Chouart de Groseilliers and Pierre Radisson. Though dissatisfied with the slight recognition they had been given them, yet Groseilliers and Radisson continued in the company's service, and in June 1670 they were off once more for the bay, with 3 ships, the Wavenot, the Shaftesbury Pink, and the Prince Rupert. Radisson seems to have been the general superintendent of trade, of which Fort Charles was the chief center. But in 1670, coasting westward in the little Wavenot, Radisson came to the point where the 2 great rivers, the Nelson and the Hayes, poured their waters side by side into the bay. His quick eye at once saw that this was a strategic point. Down these rivers came the Creuse and the Ossanabe, each spring from the region of Superior and the Lake of the Woods. Here, too, was a commodious double harbor, where whole fleets of ships might ride at easy anchorage. This was the best place on the entire bay for the headquarters of the fur trade, and Radisson at once landed on the tongue of land between the river mouths, and there erected the arms of the English king. A little later, a rude fort was constructed, and a prosperous trade thus began. But in 1672 and 1673, it was observed with alarm by the English at Fort Charles that fewer and fewer Indians were coming down the rivers to trade. What could be the reason? It was soon discovered that the French were pushing north from Canada, intercepting the Indians on their way to the bay and offering them better prices for their furs. Growing angry and suspicious, some of the English traders began to charge Groseilliers and Radisson, who had received some letters from Canada, with being in secret league with their rivals. The 2 Frenchmen, on their part, resolved to return to England and lay the whole matter before the company. It is quite possible that the letters from Canada to Radisson and Groseilliers did hold out tempting offers for their services, for they pressed the company of adventurers firmly for better terms. At last, after long debate, the governing committee voted that, quote, there will be allowed to Mr. Radisson £100 per annum in consideration of services, out of which shall be deducted what hath already been paid him, and if it pleases God to bless the company with good success thereafter, that they come to be in prosperous condition, then they will reassume consideration. End quote. Thus, at the very time when the company was making profits from 50 to 100%, it refused the men who had laid the foundation of its fortunes the position of shareholders. it would treat them only as servants and pay them a mere pittance for a wage. Ingratitude could not go further. In the fall of 1674, Groseilliers and Radisson left England and returned to France. Until 1679, Radisson served as an officer in the French Navy, but his promotion to high command was barred by the fact that his loyalty was suspect because he had married an English lady, the daughter of Sir John Kirke, a prominent shareholder in the Company of Adventurers. Then, too, the spell of the woods was ever strong upon him, so when, in 1679, he met Le Chesnay, an old friend and fur trader, who proposed to equip a French expedition to compete with the English on Hudson's Bay, Radisson at once fell in with the scheme. Soon we find him in Canada, completing arrangement with Groseilliers, who had been living quietly for some time at Three Rivers. Jean Chouart, Groseilliers' son, joined his father and uncle in the adventure. The two explorers spent the winter of 1681-82 in Acadia, and then in the spring went with the fishing fleet to Isle Percé, whither Le Chesnay had promised to send the ships for the expedition. In July they arrived, but what ships! The St. Pierre, named after Radisson, a sloop of 50 tons, and the St. Anne, an even smaller vessel, were both poorly built to buffet the northern ice, and were manned by only 25 seamen who were both mutinous and inexperienced. Men of less heroic temper would have turned back, but not so the two French voyagers. At once heading for the north, they passed through Belle Isle, coasted the treacherous Labrador, and entered the icy maelstrom of Hudson Strait. Twice the crews mutinied, but each time the courage and tact of Radisson met the crises, and they continued their course. By August 26 they had cleared the strait, crossed the bay, and had come to anchor at the mouth of a great river which the Indians called Ka-Kiwa-Kiowe, quote, "Who comes, who goes," end quote, referring to the ebb and flow of the tide. This was no other than the Hayes River. A few miles to the north lay the Nelson. It was this ideal situation which Radisson had before visited and claimed for the English king, that he now claimed for France, and resolved to make the seat of the French fur trade on the bay. They sailed up the Hayes River about 15 miles, then in a creek on the north shore made their ships snug for the winter, while Groseilliers took charge of the erection of a fort, which in honor of the French king they called Fort Bourbon. Radisson and Jean canoed up the river for about 50 miles to get in touch with the Indians. After 8 days, they met a party under an old chief. His greeting was friendly. Armed with spear, club, and bow, he stood up in his canoe, drew an arrow from his quiver, and having aimed it to the east, west, north, and south, he broke it in two, in a token of peace, and cast it into the river. Then he burst out into a chant of greeting, quote, "Ho, young men, be not afraid. The sun is favorable to us. Our enemies shall fear us. This is the man we have wished since the days of our fathers." End quote. Radisson, with great readiness, at once replied in Cree, quote, "I know all the earth. Your friends shall be my friends. I come to bring you arms to destroy your enemies. Nor wife nor child shall die of hunger, for I have brought you merchandise. Be of good cheer. I will be thy son. I have brought thee a father. He is yonder, below, building a fort, where I have 2 great ships." End quote. Gifts were exchanged, vows of eternal friendship were pledged, and the Indians promised to bring all their furs down to the fort. With this happy beginning made for their trade, Radisson and Jean rejoined their companions. One day, however, when they were all busily at work, what with their surprise to hear the boom of cannon suddenly echoing through the wilderness. Who could that be? They must find out quickly, for in the fur trade every stranger was a rival and probably a foe. Radisson took canoe and glided cautiously down the Hayes to the bay. Nothing there. The ship, then, must have ascended the other river, the Nelson. Further firing of cannon, intended no doubt to attract the Indians for trade, confirmed this guess. Returning at once to the fort, Radisson selected 3 of his trustiest men. The creek, on which the St. Pierre and St. Anne lay, ran across the marshy neck of the land between the Hayes and the Nelson, and joined the 2 rivers. Paddling and portaging along this stream, the little party reached the Nelson, and then stole silently towards its mouth. Halfway to the bay, they came upon a stranger anchored at Seal Island, on which a rough fort was already under construction. She was a stout ship called the Bachelor's Delight, well manned and armed to the teeth with cannon, which bristled through her portholes. Radisson saw in a flash that he could not openly fight this newcomer. He must have recourse to stratagem. A parley soon revealed the fact that the Bachelor's Delight was not a ship of an English company, but a New Englander illegally poaching in the company's territories. She was commanded by Ben Gillam, son of that Zachariah Gillam, who was one of the company's most trusted captains. Was it possible that they were conspiring together to cheat the adventurers? By instinct, Radisson saw that the boldest course was the safest. He introduced himself and fearlessly went aboard. The 2 commanders drank to each other's health. Radisson posed as the leader of a large expedition from Canada. He had a big party and a large fort inland and had won the allegiance of the Indians. Gillam might remain safely under his protection, and neither soldiers nor Indians would molest him or his men so long as they did not stray far from the ship. Thus condescendingly Radisson spoke. Quote, "We parted after that, well satisfied with each other, he fully convinced that I had the force of which I had boasted, and I resolved to keep him in this good opinion, having the design to oblige him to retire, or if he persisted in annoying me in my trade, to await a favorable opportunity of seizing his ship." End quote. But troubles thickened. So that Gillam might not know in which direction his camp lay, Radisson continued his way down the Nelson, when, to his amazement, at its mouth, he beheld a full-rigged ship flying the company's colors and commencing to ascend the river. At all cost, the 2 English parties must be kept apart, for if they joined together, the French would be completely outnumbered and at their mercy. Landing unperceived on the south shore, Radisson and his men built a great bonfire as though they were Indians signaling the ship to stop and trade. This trick succeeded. The vessel reefed sails and came to anchor. The next morning a boat was sent ashore. In it were Captain Zachariah Gillam and John Bridger. The new governor sent out in the ship Prince Rupert to found a permanent Hudson's Bay post on the Nelson River. When instead of Indians they found Radisson and his men on the beach with loaded muskets leveled at them, they were dumbfounded. Radisson played the same game as before. He introduced his 3 men as the captains of a large ambush party. He went aboard the English ship and dined as though the forces at his back were so strong that he had nothing to fear. He parted from them in friendly fashion, advising them not to ascend the river farther, for fear of conflict with the French and Indians. For his part, he would do his best to hold his men in check and restrain the natives. Again, his boldness was rewarded. The English prepared to construct a fort and winter where they were. Thus for a time, being the wily old Indian fighter he kept the 2 English forces apart. Only singly could he hope to crush them. To make doubly sure, however, Radisson told young Gillam of the arrival of the company's ship, and when he made his next visit to the Prince Rupert, with the coolest daring he took Ben along with him in disguise to see his father. The son could now be trusted to prevent his men from straying down the Nelson towards the company's ship, while the father, to prevent the detection and punishment of his son, would see to it that the company's men did not penetrate up the river to the poachers' fort. For a time this worked well. Then a disaster occurred. The Prince Rupert, caught in the drive of tidal ice at the river mouth, was crushed like an eggshell and sunk. With her went down Captain Zachariah Gillam, 14 men, and nearly all of the provisions. Young Gillam was now no longer needed to fear the company's force, while he was becoming extremely suspicious of the strength of the French. To spy out their numbers, he expressed a desire to pay them a friendly visit. Radisson craftily consented, and in person went to escort him. For a month, young Gillam enjoyed the hospitality of the French. They treated him courteously, but he became more and more insolent as he discovered their weaknesses. Then he tried to depart, only to find himself a prisoner. The young spy himself had been trapped by an older, slyer hand at the game of war. The next step was to capture the poachers' ship and fort by surprise. As Gillam watched, Radisson preparing to set out through the winter woods with his handful of men, he sneered at their foolhardiness. Half a league from the fort, 2 of the men were sent ahead. They were to tell the sentries that Radisson and Gillam were coming a little distance behind. Thus they would gain entrance to the fort, and with the French hostage, who had been left there to guarantee Gillam's safety, they were to watch the guardhouse and keep the gate open for the entry of Radisson's party, which would be at hand to rush in by surprise. The plan was completely successful. The fort was in French possession before the garrison could even resist, and the ship was won by a bloodless victory. In the meanwhile, Bridger had learned from the ship and the fort above him on the Nelson River. At first, he thought that they belonged to the French, but now he learned that they were really those of an English poacher. But they were at least English, and here was his chance to overpower the French. Gathering his ragged, half-starved forces together, he made the march up the river to join hands with his countrymen. At his summons, the fort's gate swung back, and he and his men marched in, only to hear the doors clash behind them again and find themselves surrounded and overpowered by the French inside. Radisson was now complete master of the situation, but he was as humane and honorable in his hour of triumph as he had been cunning and bold in the hour of danger. He fed Bridger's famished men from his own stores. When the Crees and Asinabe came down to the bay in the spring and found 60 Englishmen in the hands of a score of Frenchmen, they offered Radisson 200 beaver skins to be allowed to massacre the prisoners, but he stood the natives off. Some of the prisoners were sent in the St. Anne to the company's post in the south on James Bay. The St. Pierre had been wrecked in the spring ice, so the remaining prisoners were placed in Gillam's ship, the Bachelor's Delight, in which the voyage back to Quebec was to be made. All winter, Groseilliers and his son had been driving a profitable trade, and in the spring the Indians from the south came in with a great wealth of furs. These were safely stowed in the hold, and then, leaving Jean with a small party to hold the fort and continue the trade, Groseilliers and Radisson set sail for New France. Once again they had performed prodigies of valor and endurance in the wilderness. Once more they came to anchor beneath the citadel of Quebec, with a vast fortune in furs as their reward. Always success and prosperity seemed to wait upon the explorers in the wilds, only to forsake them when they returned to civilization and began to deal with merchants, governments, and kings. Though the king himself had given verbal sanction to their expedition, yet it had been undertaken without formal license from the government of New France. Therefore, the grasping governor, de la Barre, urged on by jealous fur-trading rivals, confiscated their furs and restored the Bachelor's Delight to Gillam. Moreover, while France and England were at peace, they had attacked the English on the bay. Therefore, they were summoned to give an account of themselves in Paris. When they landed in France, the great statesman, Colbert, had died, and affairs had passed into the hands of lesser men. The influence of the governor and of rival merchants prevailed in the court, and all their petitions for justice were in vain. At last, wearied by the struggle, the older Groseilliers gave it up and retired to spend the rest of his days at home in Three Rivers, but Radisson kept on. The French king had a secret treaty with England which he feared would be broken off if he backed up what the explorers had done. On the other hand, if he openly confessed that he had been wrong and punished them, it would mean the abandonment of all claims by France to trade in Hudson's Bay. So Radisson was ordered to return, as though by his own free will, and informally deliver up to the English the posts on the Hayes and the Nelson from which he had driven them. Thus Louis hoped at the same time to be able to preserve his secret treaty with England and maintain France's claim to share in the trade of the bay. But for Radisson, robbed time and again of his hardly won profits, to be asked in addition to undo that which he had done for the honor and glory of France was too bitter a task. The ingratitude of his king and his country made him heartsick. Then, too, in England were his wife and 4 children whom he loved dearly, while the Hudson's Bay Company, through the English ambassador, was making constant efforts to recover him for its service. Lord Preston sent one of his officers, Captain Godoy, to call upon Radisson. He found the adventurer on the 3rd floor of a house in Fowlsburg, St. Antoine. His lodgings were decked with numerous trophies and relics of his American voyages, while a group of boon companions were busy drinking to his health and listening to the story of his adventures. Godoy recalls, quote, Radisson himself was apparelled more like a savage than a Christian. His black hair, just touched with gray, hung in a wild profusion about his bare neck and shoulders. He showed a swart complexion, scarred and pitted by frost and exposure in a rigorous climate. A huge scar, wrought by the tomahawk of a drunken Indian, disfigured his left cheek. His whole costume was surmounted by a wide collar of marten skin. His feet were adorned by buckskin moccasins. In his leather belt was sheathed a long knife. End quote. Such was the picture of Radisson the Ranger in 1684, a strange, rugged, western figure upon whom the people of the day must have gazed with surprise and curiosity as he stalked the streets of London and Paris and waited upon the courts of Windsor and Versailles. Stung by the trickery and ingratitude of the French, and won back by the liberal promises of the English, Radisson now resolved to leave France. On May 10, 1684, he landed in London. His first act was to take the oath of allegiance to the English king, an oath which, to the day of his death, he kept unbroken. Well might the merchant adventurers rejoice that Radisson had returned to their services. He had shown that the 2 Frenchmen who had founded their company could as easily undermine its position. Now, with Radisson once more on their side, they felt the future assured. The governing committee met and voted him £100 per annum and the dividends on £200 of stock, which often ran as high as 50%. He was presented with a purse for his, quote, extraordinary services to their great liking and satisfaction, end quote. A dealer was commanded to, quote, keep Mr. Radisson in stock of fresh provisions, end quote. A gift of hogshead of claret was sent him, while in token of high esteem of the adventurers, he was begged to accept a silver tankard of the value of more than £10. He was received in audience by the king himself, and was taken by the Duke of York into the royal box at the theatre. For a while, Radisson was one of the most noted men in all London. Radisson's response to fair and generous treatment was immediate. In a short time he was ready to start for the bay with a fleet of 3 ships. There he induced young Jean Groseilliers to abandon his fort, and everywhere on the bay the power of the English company was re-established. On Radisson's return in November, he was publicly thanked and given a purse of 100 guineas. For 10 years, Radisson stood high in favor and continued to make trips for the adventurers to Hudson's Bay. Then came a change. War broke out with France after the fall of the Stuarts, and Radisson, the Frenchman, was held in distrust. The daring Canadian d'Iberville raided the bay, and the company's dividends ceased. New shareholders now controlled the company's stocks, few of whom knew the name and deeds of Radisson. His pension was cut as half. He was now an old man, but he remained to the end a fighter. He sued the company in the courts and won. His salary and all the areas were paid in full, but that was reward meager enough for all his services. Until 1710, the books of the company showed that Radisson's pension was paid regularly. Then, in the minute book of the governing committee, we find the entry, quote, At a committee, the 12th of July, 1710, the secretary is ordered to pay Mr. Radisson's widow the charity sum of £6. The tireless old rover of the woods and sea had gone forth on his last journey. No solemn monument marks the last resting place of Radisson, nor of Groseilliers, though lesser men have such. But that is just as well, for a wise old Greek statesman, Pericles, has truly said that, quote, "the whole earth is a sepulchre of famous men," and that the memorials of them are, quote, "graven not on stone, but in the hearts of mankind." The mighty regions which they pioneered, the imperial company which they really founded, these form their most fitting monument.